Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
And I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Tyler West, who is a historian from Dunedin in Aotearoa, as well as the author of the excellent Notes South from Nowhere blog. Thanks for joining us, Tyler.
Hey, thanks for that sweet introduction.
I guess just to begin with, could you tell us a little bit about your area of interest as a historian and what drew you to it?
So I'm primarily interested in New Zealand's political history and especially the history of, I guess you could call them social movements and fringe politics. So my own inclination towards the more radical left has led me to be interested in preserving some of that history, but I'm also interested in the other side of the coin because that history has also not really been written about to the extent that it could be. And I think the thing that drew me to that is, besides my own personal politics, an increasing appreciation for, I guess, the diversity of New Zealand history and how intricate and deep it actually is, which is not something that even people in New Zealand often get a true sense for.
Tyler, you recently co-wrote a chapter in the book Histories of Hate, The Radical Right in Aotearoa. The chapter was A Bastion of White Supremacy, Southern Africa in the Political Imagination of New Zealand's Radical Right. And you look at relations between white supremacy in New Zealand and in the white supremacist Southern African states across the broad swathe of the last century. Could you tell us a little bit about where South Africa sort of fit into the New Zealand imagination?
Yeah, so I co-wrote that chapter with Dr. Sebastian Potgieter here at the university, and we decided to take a pretty broad look at that history because it really goes back to New Zealand's first substantial encounter with Southern Africa, which is via the South African War from 1899 to 1903. And in immediate aftermath of that war, there was a relatively substantial movement in New Zealand that opposed the importation of Chinese labor into the Transvaal to work the gold mines there. That movement was very tied into the racial fears of the arrival of Chinese labor in New Zealand, which had resulted here in quite a number of harsh anti-immigrant bills amidst fears of other immigrant communities as well. And that established this basic racial and imperial solidarity between very particularly anti-Chinese New Zealanders and, at the very least, Anglo-Saxon settlers in Southern Africa. And that would be the first encounter. A group called the White New Zealand League would also take an interest in Chinese labor coming to New Zealand in the 1920s. And then later on in the 60s, initially when the colonial structure that Rhodesia was a part of at the time, the setup that they were a part of at the time with Nyasaland had started to come apart, there became an interest in what would become Rhodesia in New Zealand. And so you had these Rhodesia friendship associations emerge, and they would take up a very similar politics to these earlier groups in the 1900s through 20s, but they would have more of an interest less in just the Anglo-Saxon race per se, and more in whites generally. And they also added an element of anti-communism to their framework as well. So there was this multifaceted interest in Southern Africa, and that would persist into the 1980s with an explosion of different groups that expressed their support and solidarity with the white governments of Southern Africa, especially Rhodesia and South Africa, And of course, quite famously, there would be the 1981 Springbok tour of New Zealand, which caused a great deal of civil unrest. And that would be the last great big moment for these groups. That's about the long and short of what our chapter covers, but I'm happy to go into greater detail.
Yeah, I was curious. There's this affection for the white supremacist states in Southern Africa from New Zealand. Was that affection reciprocated? Were the people in Rhodesia, South Africa, and places like that looking at New Zealand for ideas as well?
I'm not sure about Rhodesia, personally, but I do know that there were close relations between some of the larger and more vocal groups that express support for apartheid and groups and writers, whatnot, within apartheid South Africa itself. And at least at one point, some of the organizations that were active in New Zealand were sending delegations over to South Africa. And at one point, one of those organizations attended, I guess you could call it a summit or a meeting with the South African Rugby Board, the SARB, to look into getting direct funds from South Africa to these groups in New Zealand in the aftermath of the 1981 tour, but it never eventuated. There were also groups that looked to the white South African right, especially a guy named Ivor Benson, who was a proto-Alex Jonesy figure. He had newsletters and he published books, and it was primarily an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about the forces that wanted to bring down white South Africa. Stuff that you would see on the internet quite a lot today, but instead of being online, it was in the form of newsletters. So those links definitely existed. I don't think they were as strong as they could have been or had as much influence in New Zealand as they could have. Certainly, for example, that funding that one of the organizations wanted from the SARB never eventuated. But had South Africa been in a position where it could fund these sorts of groups, there is another world where that tie could have been closer, but in R1 it wasn't quite as much.
Tyler, I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail about which individuals and organisations were especially active in promoting white rule in Southern Africa, I guess across the stretch of the last century, and who belonged to these associations, and did they contain prominent members of the establishment, or were they more proletarian?
So there were a good at least half dozen prominent organisations that were directly set up to express friendship and solidarity between New Zealand and the Southern African states. Earlier on, it was more focused on Rhodesia. I think the most prominent was a group called the Aid Rhodesia Movement, and that was founded by a guy, Lieutenant Colonel A.C.R. Elderton, in 1966. He was a veteran of World War II. He was in the King's African Rifles in the Indian Army. He was also a former National Party secretary, and his group was relatively large and prominent. I think him being a war veteran and an officer at that probably helped that along. He would also go on to later found a different organization that was explicitly pro-South African as well. Another one of the early pro-Rhodesian groups, the New Zealand Rhodesia Society, was formed a little bit earlier. It was actually formed before the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland dissolved. And that group was a lot more respectable in terms of its membership. So to take that group, its founders included the mayor of Dargaville, which is a regional town in the North Island, Sam Green, as well as a guy named James Andrew, who was a member of the New Zealand Wool Board, who was a Federated Farmers Dominion councillor, and he was also a National Party branch founder in a place called Pahiatua. And their vice presidents also included the likes of a couple National Party MPs, one of whom was knighted and was a former Minister of Education, Broadcasting, Science and Industrial Research, as well as being the sitting Speaker of the House at the time. So these earlier groups, you had both groups that were a lot more explicit. Elderton would do stuff like he would post adverts in newspapers that had some pretty explicit race science about the relative IQ of different races and the genetic capacity of certain races. Whereas the other group, the New Zealand Rhodesia Society, aimed a lot more towards respectability. It had elected members of parliament. It had, fairly prominent local politicians in regional towns, that sort of thing, as membership. The later organizations, as far as I can tell, tended a little bit more toward mass appeal, and they differed a lot. They were a bit more, I guess you could say, populist in their appeal. And one of the major ones, a group called the Association Defending South African Tours, was chaired by a guy, B.B. Thompson. Now, B.B. Thompson had been in the New Zealand National Front. In fact, he was one of the people that helped form New Zealand's National Front. And he also was a founder of a group called the Friends of Chile, which was pro-Pinochet in the mid-1970s. So you had both these more respectable groups, but also some of these groups that had a more extreme right-wing activist base. And some of them, like the groups that Elderton led, were a lot more populist and aiming for ordinary members. And Elderton would be rewarded with that to an extent when he founded the South Africa Friendship Association, which at one point claimed about 5,000 members, or at least it claimed that it had about 5,000 members, which is quite significant for a group in New Zealand's usually quite small radical right.
Do you think there might have been a little bit of fudging of the numbers there, or were these sentiments popular?
It's hard to tell with the individual organizations. I couldn't say whether it was that case one way or the other. It may well be the case that they had 5,000 people on a mailing list, or they had 5,000 paying members who weren't necessarily active. I would say it's probably more something like that. But it is, like, these organizations at least had enough resources and legitimacy that they were able to get meetings with people in national office, and were able to do stuff like launch nationwide advertising campaigns. So that money had to be coming from somewhere, and because there's no evidence of them getting grants from anywhere in South Africa, it's probably more the case that sympathetic people in New Zealand were providing that money for them to be able to do that. And certainly across New Zealand, it was not uncommon for there to be fairly strong sentiment that was either softly pro-apartheid or at the very least neutral to the goings-on in Southern Africa, and more just interested in maintaining sporting contacts with Southern Africa, with South Africa in particular. There's Keith Sinclair, who is a pretty famous biographer and historian in New Zealand. He wrote a biography of Holyoake, who was at one point New Zealand's long-running Prime Minister in the 1960s. And he notes that during Holyoake's time and towards the end of that government, especially when Jack Marshall came to prominence at the very end of that government, there were definitely people with very high ranking in New Zealand's government that were expressing some degree of sympathy, at least for New Zealand maintaining contact with South Africa, if not at least being to varying degrees pro-apartheid as well. So I think the organ probably fudged their numbers a little to make themselves seem bigger than they were, but I wouldn't be surprised if the fudging was just they were claiming paper members as being more active than they were. I wouldn't be surprised if they really did have mailing lists or people making small financial contributions into the thousands. It wouldn't surprise me at all.
Could you speak a little more to the ways in which anti-communism informed the radical right's embrace of white rule in Southern Africa?
Yeah, so the anti-communism angle was something that was a bit more new to that 60s and 70s period, right in the middle of the Cold War. A lot of these organizations were essentially arguing that the cause of African liberation, these African nationalist movements and African liberation movements, were a vanguard or were linking up with the Soviet Union. And in many cases, a lot of these liberation organizations had at least some degree, if not were quite directly tied to either the Soviet Union or in some cases the People's Republic of China. But this was all connected to what would today be quite familiar conspiracies about, for example, the United Nations being a communist-controlled front, that sort of thing. And the way I like to look at it, and we didn't quite frame it like this, but the idea is definitely present in our chapter, is that there were different pillars of support for continued contact with South Africa, and that people who were associated with this movement tied themselves more or less to one or the other of these pillars of support. And a big one was this permanent conservative anti-communism, which saw the fact that, for example, the ANC was allied to the South African Communist Party, and from there saw the entire project of being opposed to apartheid, or the opposition to apartheid within South Africa, as being irrevocably tainted by association with communism. And this, of course, blended with theories about the decline of the white race. A lot of them saw where they had once, back in the 10s and 20s, seen Southern Africa as this kind of frontier bastion for the British Empire, they now increasingly saw it, even if they had some degree of Commonwealth sympathies, as more still this frontier bastion idea, but less for the British Empire and more for the right way race. And because of the left's opposition to racism more generally and tying racism in New Zealand to governments such as apartheid South Africa, they saw what were political commitments on the part of communist organizations either in South Africa or in New Zealand or wherever they happened to be looking. And they drew from that all of these things were part of one big communist conspiracy, rather than being able to see that, for example, the South African Communist Party was opposed to apartheid on principle rather than controlling the ANC as a front or anything like that.
Tyler, in the chapter, you also examine the controversial Springboks tours. Obviously, everyone in this interview is a big jock, but I'm mindful of the fact that some of our listeners might be nerds. Could you perhaps put into context why continued sports contact between New Zealand and South Africa was so important to apartheid supporters?
So in the context of the boycott of sporting and cultural connections to South Africa that was a big part of the international anti-apartheid movement and something that the ANC had called for, one of the big things that was particularly relevant to New Zealanders was the fact that because New Zealand has this extraordinary rugby culture, for good or ill, numerous governments had been unwilling to go all the way to completely cutting off all connection, or they had been cagey about how these connections were maintained. Now, previous tours in the 1960s and also one in 1973 had been cancelled before they were undertaken, but these things weren't so much a matter of the government stepped in and said, no, you can't do that, so much as the government advised the New Zealand Rugby Union Board that this would be unwise, this could cause a great deal of unrest, and the New Zealand Rugby Union Board stepped back and reconsidered in these cases whether or not it was actually a good idea to pursue these things. I say the board, it's technically the New Zealand Rugby Football Union, but I mean the upper brass of the NZRFU. So previously, it hadn't gotten quite to the point where a tour had been organised, and this was the one big thing that anti-apartheid groups in New Zealand could really do to pressure South Africa and to pressure their own government about its relations with South Africa. But when Robert Muldoon was elected in 1975, part of his platform was that he did not want the government to get involved in trying to prevent the NZRFU and the SARB from organising tours either in South Africa or in New Zealand. So by the time in 1980 that it was announced that there was going to be a tour and it was going ahead, the anti-apartheid movement had had a long period where they had successfully disrupted and essentially cancelled a lot of other sporting and cultural contacts that existed with South Africa. And the big one that was left was rugby, which has an enormous place in both South African and New Zealand culture. And so when the 1981 tour happened in the winter of 1981, the entire the entire anti-apartheid movement had basically one goal in mind. All of the people that supported apartheid for one reason or another, or just didn't want any relation between politics and sports, also had something to rally around. Which led to a great deal of unrest throughout the tour.
Tyler, could you speak a little bit about the involvement of the League of Rights in perhaps creating some false support for the tour? It seemed like there was some surreptitious letter-writing campaigns.
Yeah, so the League of Rights are one of the groups that I've been most interested in, largely because they were both quite large for the type of organisation they were. Obviously, they were connected to the organisation of the same name in Australia, which was also fairly large for that type of organisation, to my understanding. But also, they were able to operate a significant number of front organisations, as well as using those front organisations to maintain links to various degrees with the upper echelons of the National Party. When it came to 1981 and the tour, because they did not really have the organising capacity to pull off any large street movement, the League of Rights, by the early 1980s, it was becoming well known just how extreme some of their views were, especially the more anti-Semitic beliefs that they inherited from the early days of the social credit movement, with the League being a Douglas credit organization. They opted more for letter writing and pressure campaigns and mailbox stuffing. And by having people target a particular newspaper, one that we look at in the chapter, this was more Sebastian's role, was the Otago Daily Times, which is one of the larger independent newspapers. It covers a significant part of the lower South Island, all of Otago, but it also has papers in neighbouring regions as well. The Otago Daily Times received, in the build-up to 1981 and during the tour, a significant number of letters from people who just signed off as residents from New Zealand, from Dunedin and the surrounds, but were actually responding to this League of Rights campaign of letter writing. Now, I think support for the tour was widespread enough that the ODT probably did receive quite a number of letters just from random people who supported the tour or otherwise didn't want sport and politics to mix together. But at least some of those letters were being written by people who were known to be League of Rights members and organisers, but who weren't mentioning their affiliation when they were writing these letters in. So it's a bit of a mixture. I think a lot of people authentically probably did respond to all of this letter writing and pitched in their own 2 cents. But there was definitely an element of groups like the League of Rights trying to get their members and to make the impression that support for apartheid and opposition to the tour was very widespread. And I think, and Sebastian also pointed this out, it seems like, and I think there were probably editors of at least some newspapers who weren't quite aware of what was going on in that sense.
In the chapter, there's also a reference made to a group known as the Society for the Protection of Individual Rights, which sounds quite benign, but can you elaborate on its role in the promotion of apartheid in New Zealand?
Yeah, so the Society for the Protection of Individual Rights, it was founded quite late. It was founded in April 1981, so this is only a couple months before the arrival in the Springboks and the beginning of the tour, and they would continue to exist after the tour as well. But they were part of a number of organizations. They were by far the most prominent. They claimed 10,000 members at one point, and I would say it's probably the case that they at least had 10,000, signed up paper members at the least, because they were quite widespread in their attempts to influence New Zealand politics. But the thing that really differentiated them is that their primary focus was this much more socially liberal to libertarian focus on individual rights, hence the name. And they looked at the rights of spectators, essentially, the rights of ordinary citizens to be able to engage in sport unimpeded, and took issue with the unrest that the police and the anti-apartheid movement was engaging in, obviously taking much more of the side of the police and putting all of the blame on the anti-apartheid movement. And these organizations, and Spear in particular, were quite successful in putting across this notion that you could have no position on Southern Africa or not be interested in Southern Africa or be completely neutral on what was happening in Southern Africa while still being opposed to the tour on principle. And this actually did have some cachet with people, because there was a very significant portion of New Zealand that supported the tour but weren't necessarily themselves in any way pro-South Africa. They really did see it as sports being this important cultural and social thing that needed to be free from being corrupted per se by politics. And so they were able to reach people who probably wouldn't have been reached by organizations like the League of Rights or the earlier pro-Rhodesian or pro-South African organizations that existed. And they were able to do so to the extent that when the government held cross-organization meetings with the higher-ups of the police, of the NZRFU, and also of some of the more prominent anti-apartheid organizations like Halt All Racist Tours, Spear was able to get its representatives involved in this and be considered equal partners in these meetings that were designed to try to find some accommodation that would suit all parties. These didn't really go anywhere, but I think it is worth noting that in spite of the fact that Spear, for all of its many members, they weren't engaged in anything like mass protests or many of the official levers of power, really. they were mostly a pressure group, they were able to insert themselves in these meetings that were really meetings about the national security and were designed to cool tensions primarily between protesters and the police.
Tyler, just finally, you also look at contemporary expressions of support for white Southern African regimes amongst the New Zealand far right. Could you just briefly tell us a little bit about how those are articulated?
Yeah, so this is something that we, for various reasons, couldn't get into quite as much as we'd like to, but they warrant a mention towards the end, just before the conclusion, as a concluding note on where all of this, I guess, ideology went after the 1980s. So there are a few organizations and individuals that continue to have an interest in Southern Africa and South Africa in particular, in what is now called Zimbabwe. He briefly looked at a group called the Dominion Movement, which was active in the late 2010s and closed up shop, I believe only a couple days, or perhaps within a day, of the Christchurch shooting on March 15th, 2019. Now, the Dominion Movement, among their other activities, had gone to a All Blacks Springbok match in Wellington in 2019 with a big Save the Boer banner that they displayed. And also, they had been postering around Wellington, and I think maybe a couple other places. They had members with these Boer refugees welcome posters. They were among a group of people, a group of organizations on the radical to extreme right that were strong believers in the idea of Boer genocide or white farmer genocide in South Africa, which I believe you've covered on this show before. And their successor organization, Action Zealandia, which I don't believe we mentioned in the chapter, but Action Zealandia also in their podcast come to and talk about South Africa quite a bit. They've had guests from South Africa on the show, I believe. Although I might add, this show does seem to be defunct at the moment. And there's some other figures as well. One that we do mention is Kerry Bolton, who is a figure that's been connected to countless organizations, both in New Zealand and outside of it over the years. And notably for our discussion, was associated with the New Zealand Rhodesia Society, as well as the League of Rights back in the 70s. He's published some articles on his website, and he tends to be a bit verbose and quite lengthy. He likes to fashion himself as something of a scholar. And among the things that he's written, he has published some pretty explicitly pro-apartheid material and material about the belief in the genocide of Afrikaners. And something that we couldn't really get into was that he also published an essay a few years ago about the Portuguese Empire in Southern Africa, and that being one of the last great bastions against both communism and the attack on the white race, so to speak, as well. So there's definitely groups on the quite extreme right in New Zealand up to pretty much today, or at least within the last few years, that continue to take an interest in Southern Africa and in post-apartheid and post-white ruled politics. And some groups that aren't usually considered to be on that more extreme right have also taken something of an interest as well. There was a very small incident a number of years ago now, when a group called Hobson's Pledge, who are now actually quite prominent, led by former National Party and ACT Party leader Don Brash, posted a meme essentially, but posted on their official channels what essentially seemed to be a pro-Rhodesian message, arguing, I suppose, that Zimbabwe is a failed state under its current leadership, who, of course, they perceive at least as being entirely black and only interested in the interests of their own race, and compared it to this idea of white Rhodesian women in frocks prancing in fields, very similar to other similar tradwifey and post-original National Socialist propaganda, the Aryan women in wheat fields meme. They posted something along those lines, which was a very brief media scandal before blowing over and being memory holed. But I think it is instructive that there is this continued interest in Southern Africa on the New Zealand right.
Well, Tyler, we'll have to leave it there. If people want to see more things that you're pulling back out of the memory hole, you have a blog at notessouthfromnowhere.wordpress.com. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Andy, that's our program. We'll be back next week.
See you then.
Public transport's great, What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around?
Got 5 for the 5? The Reserve Bank of Australia is reimagining the $5 note, and we want to celebrate First Nations cultures. Tell us what theme you'd like to see on the new $5 note. Submit your idea at banknotes.rba.gov.au.
A 3CR supporter.